The Halberds are very high damaging polearm types weapons, and the way to look at them is that they're basically just as high as damaging as a greatsword, but they can just do it at a further distance and actually get more weapon skill options. Now the trade-off being is that they don't really get as much stance damage. They can stagger pretty well with almost every single one of their attacks, but in terms of stance breaking, it is just not there, especially with those charged heavy attacks. They only do 33 stance damage, and almost every single one of these heavies do this spinning attack, which is just a very long animation. It doesn't really feel like it does enough damage to compensate, but the good area in coverage that they offer is obviously going to be their major benefit. Now, another unfortunate thing about the Halberds is that I don't typically like their power stancing options. They have like these really long and sluggish animations, and I'd rather just like two-hand them for the most part. Now for today, we are going to rank all 18 of them from worst to best based on how useful they are and how well they perform in PvE. But yeah, let's just get right into it. Starting off at the bottom, the Gargoyle's Black Halberd. Basically, any single time that the Gargoyle Black weapon appears in these lists, it's like almost always going to be at the bottom because these things religiously get some of the worst damage, the worst range, terrible scaling, split holy damage, and like a non-unique skill that cannot be changed because yeah, these things can't be infused nor buffed. And for every single Gargoyle Black weapon, there's like a regular Gargoyle weapon, and that one is just going to be the direct upgrade because it's going to have the same moveset, range, weight, but it just can be infused, meaning that it can get more damage and just have more versatility. I don't know why most of these black Gargoyle weapons didn't get this like cool Destined Death or Black Flame types of skills. Would have been pretty nice. Don't care if it would have been a reskin type of skill. It deserves to have one. But this thing can't get a mixture of terrible range, terrible scalings, and no unique skill. Like, it just can't happen. Number 17, the Spirit Glaive, which is one of a handful of very disappointing weapons to come out of the DLC. This weapon gets the regular Halberd moveset, and it also is the lightest Halberd in the entire game, weighing at only 6.5 units. But the reason why I'm never going to care for it is because it gets terrible scalings, terrible damage, and a basically useless skill. This is a predominantly dexterity intelligence based weapon, but the scalings are so bad to the point that even at these really high levels, it just performs like trash. Like a Guardian Swordspear with a cold infusion with the same stats, it's just going to get way higher damage and actually give you access to frost buildup and the ability to change up the skill. Because this weapon skill is just a reskinned version of Sword Dance, which Sword Dance in itself is okay. It's a nice way to close in the gap. In terms of damage or stance damage, it's not going to be the highest thing. Now this version of Sword Dance actually does give you like a projectile attack and give you a bit of frost buildup, but as I mentioned with that cold infused Guardian Swordspear, you could slap Sword Dance onto that and it's going to get more damage and more frost buildup for less FP cost. And better yet, you can change up the skill to actually something that's better than Sword Dance. So yeah, this weapon just needed better scalings, and I feel like the projectile portion of the skill just needed to have like more skulls that spawns out. Would have been nice if like 8 or 10 skulls spawned out to just make it do way more damage, but yeah, unfortunately this thing is kind of trash. Number 16, the VULGAR Militia SHOTEL, which is probably the worst of all the infusible halberds in the game. It gets some of the worst range and some of the worst damage, and combined with the fact that it just gets like the basic halberd moveset that you have to farm for it as well, there's like no real reason to actually want to use this thing. Like the only benefit that it does have over the other halberds is that it can bypass shields slightly. Like you can just do a bit of chip damage around like a shield, which is like borderline useless in PvE, because not only are there like very small amounts of enemies that actually use shields, but like all the shielded enemies don't even like block with the shield. Like most of the knights that have a shield, they use it more times to attack than they actually use it to block. So this little gimmick effect is definitely not worth like the way less range and way less damage that it has. Number 15, the PEST'S Glaive, which is another infusible halberd. This one getting like the worst damage out of all the halberds in basically every single infusion. Now actually it still does have a few benefits. It is like one of the lightest halberds. It does actually get slashing damage, and it does give you a boost to your elemental damage negation, but it's only like 2% more elemental damage negation, which is like not even noticeable at all. And you're just going to be much better off with another weapon that actually does respectable damage. Like if you wanted a really light halberd option, you could just go with the Lucerne because you don't have to farm for that one. It's going to get more damage and a better moveset. If you actually did want like a slashing damage halberd for whatever reason, you could just go with the regular glaive. It's going to weigh a little bit more and have a bit higher requirements, but the extra bit of damage is just way worth it. So yeah, I kind of wish this thing actually had like a unique skill instead of actually being an infusible halberd. I feel like it would have had a lot more use. But yeah, the way it stands right now is that it's like a really bad damaging halberd. Number 14, the LORETTA'S War Sickle. Weapon gets some of the most range in class. It gets some decent scalings. It actually has a really good moveset as it does share the exact same one as the Guardian Swordspear, which this light attack combo is like the fastest out of all the halberds, and it actually doesn't take a trade-off in terms of damage. It doesn't actually stagger enemies as well as like the regular halberds. When you're fighting enemies like omens or even knights, this moveset doesn't actually stagger those enemies, which can be very unfortunate. But the main reason why I don't really care about this weapon much is because it doesn't get a unique skill. It just gets stuck with Loretta's Slash, and Loretta's Slash is not even that good of a skill, and if you really wanted to use it, you could just slap it onto the Guardian Swordspear and that one is just going to be a better version of this weapon. With an intelligence build and a magic infusion, it can just literally get more damage. Now at really high levels with an int dexterity build, the LORETTA'S war sickle can outdamage it, but it's not going to get that much more damage than like a cold infused guardian swordspear. And obviously that weapon is going to have the ability to get frost and also be able to change up its skill to a bunch of different things that are just going to be more useful than LORETTA'S slash in my opinion. Like it would have had more of a use if it was like earlier on in the game, because it could be like an early somber based weapon, but unfortunately you get it all the way like in the Halberd tree and it just gets like a non-unique skill. Like LORETTA has plenty of different attacks. I don't understand why they couldn't just add any one of them onto it. So yeah, definitely a missed opportunity because this thing looks really cool. Number 13, the Glaive, which this weapon does get some pretty respectable range and actually some of the most damage in class, and actually does get you some slashing damage. Not that high for requirements, doesn't really weigh that much either. Like it's a perfectly fine and serviceable halberd. You'd have to farm for it, which can be pretty annoying. But I think that that's its only use, is like a basic generic halberd, and there are just like much better options out there. Like this weapon does scale best off strength, and if you are going to go into a strength build, you might as well just use the NIGHTRIDER's Glaive. That weapon does have higher requirements and weigh a little bit more, but it just gets way more damage, more range, also gets slashing damage, boosted damage on horseback, and it gets a better moveset. But it could be better to use earlier on until you meet the requirements for the NIGHTRIDER's Glaive, but I think that's its only use. Number 12, the GARGOYLE'S Halberd, which this weapon actually does have the highest amount of damage with a strength-based infusion, and almost with every other infusion, it just gets some of the highest damage too. Now, the reason why it's still going to get into the C tier is because it doesn't beat out the NIGHTRIDER's Glaive by much. It's like 5 to 10 AR at these higher levels, and the NIGHTRIDER's Glaive gets basically the exact same requirements, same weight, but it just has way more range, gets slashing damage, gets the better movesets, can do more damage on horseback. You can get it way earlier in the game as well. Like I'd gladly just sacrifice like just 10 more damage just to be able to have this much more range. Like the purpose of halberds is to have respectable range. Otherwise, you just use a greatsword because greatswords get basically similar speeds and movesets, but just more damage. So yeah, I find basically next to no value in this weapon at all. Number 11, the Golden Halberd, which is a very high damaging strength faith based weapon that you can grab very early on. Now with its very high requirements, I wouldn't really still consider it to be an early game option, but this thing with a strength based build can get somewhat comparable damage to the NIGHTRIDER's Glaive, and also does get the exact same heavy attack, which is that quick downward slam, which I much prefer over like the double swiping heavy attack that the other halberds get. And with this thing actually having a little bit of a faith scaling, you can go into that stat and its benefit of even more damage potentially than the NIGHTRIDER's Glaive. And there are going to be a few problems with the weapon that make me put it into the C tier. One, it does split holy damage, so the fact that it's going to be the highest damaging weapon doesn't really mean anything in the base game, because against almost every single boss, it's definitely not going to be the highest damaging halberd, and it also just doesn't get a unique skill. The weapon gets stuck with Golden Vow, which Golden Vow is an amazing skill, but the reason why it's so good is because it's an Ash of War that you can put onto like any weapon. You can just slap it onto a dagger, leave it in your back pocket, and then switch to it at the start of every single boss fight to this benefit of more damage and more damage negation. And you can get that Ash of War basically just as early as you can get this weapon. And it's probably easier to acquire because you don't have to kill a boss for it. And what makes this thing having Golden Vow like double useless is that the weapon has a faith-based scaling, so you can just go into about 25 faith and just use the Golden Vow spell, and that's just a better version than the Ash of War. So the only benefit that it has is that it's a decent damaging halberd that requires Somber Stones to upgrade, and with how good some of the other strength and faith-based holy weapons can be, I don't think I could put this thing anything higher than a C tier. Number 10, the Ripple Crescent Halberd, a primarily arcane-based weapon, does only get average damage and average range with like just the regular halberd moveset. Unfortunately, it does require smithing stones and does not have the ability to be infused, and it is just going to get stuck with Spinning Slash, which is a pretty decent skill to have, but there are just much better things out there, and it would have been nice if that actually came with something unique. But thankfully, it actually does have the ability to be buffed, and with this ability, it actually can get a bunch of status effect buildup with a lot of different greases. Because this thing has an arcane-based scaling, using things like Bleed Grease, Poison Grease, or even Sleep Grease can just make the buildup of the status effects just super high. So just having the ability to just go back and forth between a bunch of different status effects and benefit of really good buildup is always going to be amazing. And even if you do fight enemies that are resist to a status effect, you could just use like a damaging-based buff. Now for me personally, if you actually did like this playstyle, I'd just rather have the Ripple Blade. Like this weapon basically does the exact same thing, but it's an axe instead. But this axe actually shares the same moveset as the Warped Axe, so its moveset is like incredibly fast, and the damage is like not really that much different compared to this halberd. So if you're gonna go with the status effect build, you want to be able to swing quickly, and this axe is gonna do it way better. And also if you actually wanted to go with like a bleed-based halberd, the Vulgar Militia Sword with an occult infusion is just gonna do it better too, and have the ability to be infused. So it's a perfectly fine weapon, it has good versatility, but it still is a bit outclassed in my opinion. Number 9, the Poleblade of the Bud, which as a weapon itself, it's actually really good. It has amazing range, it gets slashing damage, gets a really good arcane scaling with a little bit of a dexterity scaling, so at these higher levels, it can actually just output a lot of the other different types of arcane-based weapons. It also does share the exact same moveset as the Guardian Swordspear, which as I mentioned earlier, is actually the fastest of the Halberd movesets, and this is going to offer you like the highest amount of DPS. And on top of all this, the weapon actually does come with passive rot. Now being that it's actually the weapon version of rot, it's only going to be that 15 to 16% damage, which is still a lot higher than poison. And the fact that it comes with a status effect is obviously not a downside. But the reason why it's still going to get into the B tier is because the skill is like borderline useless, and Scarlet Rot doesn't even scale off arcane. If it did, I'd probably slide it straight into the A tier. Because yeah, this thing is just going to be stuck with like 55 rot buildup the entire time. So it's going to take a little bit to be able to proc the rot. And you think like the skill would do it like a lot faster. But no, the skill doesn't really do good rot buildup, doesn't do good damage, offers bad stance damage, has a long animation, consumes a lot of FP. And it doesn't even get hyper armor throughout like half the animation as well. Like they actually buffed it to where it gets a bit more hyper armor. I don't know why they didn't buff anything else about the weapon, but they just buffed the hyper armor and it's still not good enough. Like I actually did do an entire playthrough only using this skill just somewhat recently, and it does have like a few benefits. Like it is pretty good to use in a boss fight and be able to like dodge into cover after using it because it does like fly around a whole bunch. It also does perform pretty well against things like knights or even NPCs because it staggers pretty nicely and you're like a pretty hard target to hit. But I don't know why this thing just didn't get better rot buildup. Would have been nice if it could also proc like the 30% version of rot with just the skill, like what the spells can actually do. I don't know why this thing doesn't get a follow-up input with like a third swing, like what Romina has. Like the actual boss herself does a 3-hit combo, but when we use it, it's just a 2-hit combo with no like additional option. And I don't even know why this thing is even an arcane weapon to begin with. Like the spell that Romina has scales of faith, but this thing scales of arcane. I don't even understand what the whole thought process was behind this thing, but it definitely needs to be better. Number 8, the Commander's Standard, which this weapon does have the most range in class and also offers the Poking Attack Halberd moveset, which this Poking Attack moveset is actually faster than the regular Halberd moveset, and it's also just going to offer piercing damage as well. And there's like no trade-off in terms of damage, stagger potential, or even stance damage. Like it's basically just like the direct upgrade in terms of a light attack combo, and combined with its amazing range, it can make for a pretty decent weapon. Now unfortunately this thing cannot be infused nor buffed, but it actually does get some good damage with a strength type of build, and it can outdamage things like the Halberd or the Banished Knight's Halberd, but those things can be buffed and have the ability to be infused with different types of skills, so I'm just going to value those more, especially because the skill of this weapon is just going to be a buff. Now the buff itself is actually really good. It is an aura based buff just like Golden Vow that boosts your damage and damage negation, and actually does boost it by a higher amount than Golden Vow. It gives you 20% more damage and damage negation, which is just amazing. Now the major downside is that it only lasts 30 seconds and has a long animation, so trying to use this in the middle of a boss fight is probably not going to be very optimal. So you're only really going to benefit at the start of the boss fight, and is having more damage and damage negation for 30 seconds isn't going to be the greatest thing. I'd much rather just have a weapon that gets like a damaging based skill, because damaging based skills like Impaling Thrust, Piercing Fang, Spinning Strikes, like these things that is going to be way better to have, especially because that you can just benefit of using this skill without even having the weapon upgraded. As long as you just meet the requirements, you could just use the buff and then switch back to your main options, which does give it another use, but for only 30 seconds and having the inconvenience of like switching back and forth, I just feel like that is too inconvenient to warrant me putting it higher on a list. Number 7, the Lucerne, another infusible halberd. This one actually getting some of the worst range and some of the worst damage in class, but thankfully it has a bunch of other things going for it. One, it actually is the lightest infusible halberd. It also does have the lowest stamina cost as well with basically every single attack, and it also does get piercing damage too, which yes, I glaze every single day as it's being the best damage type, and the fact that you can get access to piercing damage without always having to result in just poking attacks is always going to be really cool. Now unfortunately for the Lucerne, it's still not going to get more damage as like the regular halberd or the Banished Knight halberd. Those also offer piercing damage and it's still a bunch of poking attacks. But I think the most underrated part about the weapon is going to be its heavy attack. It does share the exact same one as the NIGHTRIDER's glaive in that really quick downward chop, which I just much rather have this than like the double swiping heavy attack that the other halberds get, because it has like such a long animation and is hitting hard in just one hit is just going to be much more beneficial. And as of patch 1.14, the uncharged heavy attacks actually come out faster than the regular light attack, and you can just combo these back and forth the entire time. And also for whatever reason, just like the NIGHTRIDER's glaive, it also gets boosted damage on horseback. Don't really know why that's the case. And another good thing is that you don't have to farm for it as well. It's just like an amazing weapon overall. Like the only major downside of this weapon is that it's just lacking a lot of damage, but even with that less damage, I still think it's definitely deserving of this spot. Number 6, the Halberd, and number 5, the Banished Knight's Halberd. Now I'm going to talk about both of these at the same time because they're basically the exact same weapon. Very similar weight, requirements, range, damage, while having the exact same moveset and the ability to be infused. Now, the main reason why they're going to be this high is purely because of their light attack combo, which this light attack combo is just like a better version than a great spear. The light attacks are just a bunch of pokes, and it also is faster than the great spear light attack combos, while also just doing more damage and staggering just as well, and having the ability to get a 4th light attack, whereas the great spears only get 3. And you might think that it actually takes a heavy hit in terms of stance damage, but it doesn't. It only gets 1 less stance damage compared to the great spears. So if you actually felt like that the great spears were a bit too slow for you, I would just use the Halberd or the Banished Knight's Halberd. Now, still not my preferred as much as the great spears because those get better heavy attacks, and if you wanted to use different types of weapon skills like Impaling Thrust or Piercing Fang, those are just going to get more stance damage with the great spear too. Now, in terms of the differences between the two, the regular Halberd does actually just get more damage with a strength type of infusion, so if that was like the most important thing to you, then let's go with the regular Halberd. Also, if you did want to go with like bleed infusions or a cold infusion, it does retain more of a strength-based scaling, whereas the Banished Knight's Halberd actually gets more of a dexterity-based scaling. And I might actually prefer the Banished Knight's Halberd more with his elemental builds, especially with those cold infusions, because it actually gets a B scaling in intelligence and a C scaling in dexterity with this infusion. But I think the main reason why I put the Banished Knights at number 5 is that you can get a +8 version of this weapon very early on, and getting a +8 weapon right at the beginning of the game can just carry you throughout the entirety of like Limgrave and even Leonie of the Lakes. So yeah, I think both of these are just like very solid options. Number 4, the Vulgar Militia Saw, which this is a bleed-based halberd, does get the regular halberd moveset, does get some of the worst range, and the damage is not really that good when it comes to like these strength-based infusions. And the fact that you don't have to farm for it, it kind of makes you consider why you would even want to use this thing, especially over something like the Grave Scythe, which is actually another polearm type weapon that just can get more damage with a strength infusion, and just get the better moveset too. But thankfully, the Vulgar Militia Saw actually does get an amazing arcane scaling with an occult infusion. Like, this thing actually can get some of the highest damage with this infusion, which is convenient for multiple reasons. One, it's obviously going to improve your bleed build up by a whole bunch, and if you actually wanted to use Spectral Lance, this is probably going to be the best weapon to use it with. Spectral Lance is like an amazing skill that can go very far, do amazing stance damage, and it's extremely cheap. Now, the thing is, this skill does primarily scale off arcane, and there's not really many instances to where you actually are going to use like an arcane-based infusion with like a polearm type weapon, but the Vulgar Militia Saw is going to be that weapon for you because you're going to benefit off amazing damage, really good bleed build-up, and good damage with this skill. I think the only reason why I'm not going to put it into the S tier is because it still lacks the base damage and the versatility to be built around different types of infusions. And with like arcane builds, they're only typically better at like later levels. But once you do actually make yourself like an arcane build with an occult infusion with this weapon, it definitely makes for one of the best halberds. Number 3, the Guardian Swordspear, which this weapon does get the highest base damage across all the halberds, and it also does get the best dexterity scaling too. Now, typically with halberds, as I've mentioned, you kind of just want to have them two-handed the entire time because their power setting combos aren't really as good. And with a two-handed build, you kind of want to go more into a strength type of infusion. So that is like one downside that having a dexterity-based halberd can actually have. But the Guardian Swordspear does just have the fastest halberd moveset, and just having like some of the most damage alongside the fastest movesets means the highest DPS. And this really fast light attack combo doesn't actually take a hit in damage nor stance damage. Now, unfortunately, and I think the most annoying part about this moveset is that it does take a hit in stagger potential. If you want to use this thing against like knights or omens, these light attacks don't stagger them, where like regular halberd attacks would. So I think that's the most annoying part about the moveset. Now, you could just use your heavy attacks to do the job instead, but unfortunately it still gets that spin to win heavy attack, which I like a lot more in the previous games, whereas in this game, having high stance damage and quick animations is just imperative. This type of heavy attack doesn't really offer you much, especially because in the time that you can do this charged heavy attack, you could just use 3 light attacks and just do like way more damage and actually do more stance damage. Number 2, the Dragon Halberd, which is another halberd that does get the poking attack moveset, does actually scale best off strength, and actually can get some decent damage. It's not going to get like anywhere near as much damage as things like the NIGHTRIDER's glaive, but the fact that it is going to offer you pure piercing damage, it might just end up being just as good in terms of DPS. But the best part about the weapon is going to be its unique skill, which is just like a reskinned version of Spinning Slash. And Spinning Slash is like a good way to stagger enemies. It can like stun lock those smaller ones too. But specifically with the Dragon Halberd, it turns it into like this Frost Lightning AoE attack that could just hit super hard and also buff the weapon. And this is probably one of the best weapon buffs in the entire game too. It actually adds 160 lightning damage and 80 frost buildup. Like most weapon buffs in this game only add you like 100 or even 120, whereas this thing is 160 and adding you a really good status effect. So this thing can just turn into like a heavy hitting machine. It also does do bonus damage against dragons, and best of all yet, you can get it very early on in the game, which having an early game weapon that can be upgraded with Somber Stones is one of like the best ways to just break the game wide open, especially because this thing is actually giving you a flat damage buff with its skill, which flat damage buffs are just going to perform especially good early game. So yes, this weapon is just just phenomenal. It gets an amazing moveset, high damaging skill, gets option to a status effect, and it's easy to upgrade. And that's number 1, the NIGHTRIDER's GLAIVE, which actually is one of the highest damaging halberds in the game, and actually does have the most range out of all the infusible halberds too. Now, as I mentioned with the Gargoyle's halberd, it doesn't get as much damage as that. It is like the second highest damaging halberd to that weapon, but it's only by like 5 to 10 AR. But it gets way more range, gets access to slashing damage, gets the better moveset, gets more damage in horseback, and you can get it earlier in the game. So this thing is just going to be the best halberd in my opinion. I know people might prefer the Guardian SWORDSPEAR over this weapon, but like as soon as the heavy attack changes came out with patch 1.14, it's just not even close, because this weapon does get the best heavy attack out of all the halberds, with that really quick downward slam, which does like just as much stance damage as the regular halberd moveset, but in just like half the speed. And as of patch 1.14, these uncharged heavy attacks come out faster than a light attack while having like a very similar animation. So you can just go heavy attack into light attack and its benefit of like so much more damage. Like the only downside that I could really say about this weapon is that it does have higher requirements. So you're only really going to be using this with a strength-based build. And also, as of the DLC, the sword lance does exist, which the sword lance literally gets higher AR than the NIGHTRIDER's glaive. So if you actually did want to use different types of skills like impaling thrust, or a braggart's roar build, a piercing fang build, even a guard countering build, this weapon is just going to do that better. But the NIGHTRIDER's glaive obviously does benefit of both slashing damage and piercing damage, also while having more range and having the option to have polearm types of skills. So things like phantom slash or even spinning strikes, you're just best off using things like the NIGHTRIDER's glaive. Okay, that is now all 18 halberds now ranked, and I think that this video is probably like the last of like all like the really large categories. I think at this point all the other categories are just not going to have many weapons in them. The next one I think is going to be the scythes, and there's probably only about like 5 or 6 of those. So if you are interested in that, please do subscribe, and also do follow me on Twitch because I'm live there every single day doing a bunch of challenge runs, testing out all these different weapons, so it actually can give some more validity to these lists. Anyway, I'll catch you guys around. Bye!